Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've just moved to a semi-arid area. About 9 months ago, I moved to the University of Saskatchewan from a relatively humid place. So it's been a great learning experience hearing about processes in semi-arid and arid environments. I've changed the title of my talk a little bit to perhaps link to the discussion later this afternoon. And I'll be focusing on flow processes and water regimes in seasonally dry environments. And this is a connection I'm hoping to make to the conference theme. And if I think about this from a process field-based point of view, and I had to draw a cartoon perhaps to outline at least how I think our state of process understanding is, this one might be it. So what I'm going to talk about first is water availability and give you some suggestion as to what stable isotopes are implying. And in fact, I'll talk about this two water worlds hypothesis. And then a little bit about flow processes and what hill slope scale precipitation runoff relationships look like. And I'll do this from, again, the field perspective, from the perspective of data gathering at the hill slope to catchment scale. So that's going to be my focus for the next 25 minutes or so. And much of this talk is going to utilize information from naturally occurring stable isotopes. So we've not heard much about that yet. So I just wanted to put a figure up if this is not something you've seen so much before. But what we do is embrace the natural isotopic composition of rainfall, and we might look at the input signal, which here I'm showing over about 6 or 7 years. So we get a lot of variation in this signal seasonally, with closer to zero during summertime, more negative during colder periods. And then we use the hill slope, the catchment. We think of this as a filter that damps and lags this input signal in terms of what comes out the bottom. So the beauty of this is that it's really tracing the water molecule. It's added naturally during rain events, and this is, I think, another kind of useful, almost orthogonal signal to runoff relations. Like stream flow, it makes sense across all scales. In fact, rather than tracking, though, the pressure propagation through a watershed, this is actually tracking the particle movement. So the two together, I think, are quite important in constraining one's conceptualization of how water, where water goes when it rains and what the flow path might be. Now, the first thing I'd like to talk about in terms of water availability is not where streams get their water, but where trees get their water. And we can use the isotope technique to try to understand where are the trees accessing water in the subsurface. This is a 1 square kilometer watershed in the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest in Oregon. It's a Mediterranean climate, admittedly a wet Mediterranean climate, but we have three months of largely rain-free conditions. And I'm going to show you data along this transect in this small watershed shown here, where we've sampled the tree water, the xylem water, and we've sampled the soil water. So as we go down the transect here in this kind of U-shaped pattern, this is the y-axis is the soil depth, and here's the deuterium composition. And these are soil water samples that we've taken on 2 sampling periods. And you can see the change in deuterium composition with depth becoming more negative with depth. And if we sample the xylem water in the tree, we can relate that to the depth at which the vegetation is accessing its water. And here I'm showing where the vegetation samples would plot on this plot. So these are 50-year-old Douglas fir, and they're showing that the trees are actually using water from a fairly narrow band within the subsurface. And this is useful for us in terms of understanding the catchment hydrology in terms of where trees are accessing water through the profile. It was surprising to us how narrow this band was through several sampling periods at this site. Now, in catchment hydrology or watershed hydrology, we often look at these data through the lens of a meteoric water line plot. Now, it's the same thing that I showed you in the earlier plot. We look at the variations in, for instance, the precipitation signal. Now that precipitation signal is spanning this range in this linear relation between O18 and deuterium. And if we look then at the soil water samples, these are collected at different depths from 30 centimeters to about 1.20 meters. You see a compressed version of that input signal. And then if we circle here the stream water samples, this is greatly lagged and damped. just like you'd see in a time series kind of plot. But when we go to watersheds around the world, particularly in more humid areas, all of the samples that I've collected have fallen on this meteoric water line. Now, this is important because it relates to how we interpret the mixing in the subsurface. So we assume that the trees, in terms of transpiration and groundwater recharge that links to stream flow, are all sampling from the same well-mixed tank. This is an assumption that we make in our watershed models. And what I'd like to do is test this assumption with data from a watershed, again in Oregon at the H.J. Andrews site. This is watershed 10, a 10-hectare site, where we're going to look at stream flow data from the outlet, but also these dots that are long-term vegetation plots. So we'll look at stream water and vegetation water at this site, and at a number of permanent vegetation plots where we have a long-term record. So I'm going to show you now data that explores this same kind of data set in terms of the meteoric water line, but we'll look at stream flow data and vegetation data throughout this watershed. And this was a conversation that happened over beer with Renee Brooks. She's a plant ecophysiologist at the EPA in Corvallis, where we plotted again the same kind of meteoric water line plot, this linear relation between O18 and deuterium. The precipitation, the stream water that I sample is roughly on the line, as all those samples that I've looked at before have been. But when we looked at her tree data, it plotted off the meteoric water line. And anything on this side of the line is a telltale sign of evaporation. We really scratched our heads because in all of the stream flow data I've ever looked at, I've never seen water plotting below the meteoric water line. And of course, the trees are using soil water. Soil water, if we plot the soil water data, that now bracket the tree water data. So shallow soil water is farthest away from the meteoric water line, deep soil water becoming onto the meteoric water line. This is suggesting two different water worlds, or in other words, the tree water and the stream water, or the water from where the trees are getting their water is not seen in the stream, and the water we see in the stream, the trees don't seem to be interested in using in this case. And this comes down to, I think, the way that we sample these waters. So in fact, as hydrologists, we use a suction lysimeter. We might put a porous cup device in the ground, establish perhaps 60 inches of mercury pressure to sample the water from the unsaturated zone. In ecology, we sample soil water and leaf water, or xylem water, using cryogenic extraction, where we get down to about 15 megabars of suction. And in each case, when we look at the two waters, the bulk soil water is always more depleted than the lysimeter water. And this is providing strong evidence that these two pools are not mixing. At least the water that we're sampling from these two pools does not appear to be mixing. And our conceptual model, from admittedly a wet place generally, although seasonally dry, is that these two water worlds express themselves in a kind of a layering that's set up in the fall wet period, where we get recharge of this very dried down kind of system that then is locked into place through the wet winter months when we have mobile water coursing through these soils, recharging groundwater, forming stream flow. This is a very dynamic place in terms of rainfall runoff, but our ecology and hydrology are almost perfectly out of phase here. So the rain comes in the winter when the vegetation's not so active. The vegetation's active when it's largely rain-free in the summer period, and then when the dry season turns on and the rain turns off, our transpiration really seems to be coming from this layer cake of isotopic composition that's largely set up during the pre-rain period at the end of the summer. Now, we've seen this at other sites, both in Mexico and the Oregon Coast Range. Again, these are seasonally dry sites. Again, if we look at the data in the meteoric water line plot, again, the soil water and vegetation water plotting off the line, whereas our mobile water, the stream flow and the groundwater and the mobile soil water plotting on the line. So our kind of conceptual model is that we really have this other meteoric water line, that's effectively the soil evaporation line, and plants are exploiting water between these two kind of end members, if you like, the mobile water end member and the poorly mobile water end member. And this is something that we're starting to now go after in different sites that perhaps aren't seasonally dry in the summertime. We're working in Scotland and also South Carolina to see if, in fact, we see similar types of behavior. But this is suggesting that the assumption of a well-mixed reservoir in the subsurface is perhaps not a good one. Now, in terms of flow processes, I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about runoff response. And interestingly, whereas on the plant side we assume a single reservoir, and we've seen now multiple water worlds, if you like, on the runoff side we assume multiple runoff mechanisms. In fact, this is a classic diagram from Dunn 78. It's been built upon for many decades. A lot of what we do in rainfall runoff research is kind of going out and looking for unique runoff mechanisms in ever more diverse environments. These would be three of the main types of runoff generation processes: Horton overland flow, infiltration excess overland flow, and then within this kind of variable source area concept, subsurface storm flow in wetter zones or direct precipitation onto saturated areas, or saturation excess overland flow. And again, this might vary depending on topography, soils, climate, land use. But I think the prevailing wisdom, or the approach that's been taken for the last several decades, is to think about the further distinguishing between these types of mechanisms. And what I wanted to put in front of you today is perhaps a sense that maybe all of these runoff processes are in fact the same, or share a very similar response mechanism. And I'll start off with a hill slope. This is in Georgia. This is a Panola Watershed. It's a hill slope where we've been working for some time. It's in the southern Piedmont. Here's the soil surface topography. This is the subsurface topography, and we've trenched along the base of the hill slope. And what I want to show you is some data that look at the development of perched water tables down at this soil-subsoil interface. This is a saprolite in this case, because this is the driver of lateral flow at the hill slope scale at this particular site. So here's a picture of the site, and what I want to do now is look at a grid of maximum rise wells on this particular slope. Here's the base of the slope, so we're looking in plan view. We're going to step through a series of rain events and look at these zones where we've detected saturation down at the soil bedrock interface. So this again is at this soil bedrock interface. I'm not saying anything about how thick that water table or perched water table might be, just whether or not we detected any zone of saturation. So here's a slightly larger event, 9 millimeters of rain, 16 millimeters, going up in terms of event size. These are all separate events during a particular field year, and this is work of Ilya Tromp van Meerveld. Getting up to about 50 millimeters, and all of a sudden at 59 millimeters, we see connectivity to the slope base. Here's a larger event, and still maintaining this connectivity. Now, the important point, I think, is that if we look at the relationship between this storm precipitation size and flow from the base of the slope, it's very threshold-like. And going back to the discussions that we had this morning, I think this, in hydrology at least, the link between these patterns of connectivity and thresholds has been a very useful way of understanding this kind of emergent behavior at the hill slope scale. And this, in fact, came about from actually some work in John's lab. Ilya took a soil physics class with John, worked with Hydrus 2D, and we saw evidence in Hydrus 2D of some strange kind of filling and spilling from the top down. This then is what motivated this deployment of about 50 or 60 wells on the hill slope, and in fact this behavior came about from some of that initial model disbelief, in fact, in terms of what was going on. Now, we've seen the same kind of threshold behavior at a number of our sites since then. Here's a steeper, wetter site in New Zealand. Again, here's storm flow on the y-axis, again versus storm precipitation. A smaller threshold. Here it only takes about 20 millimeters to activate the lateral flow. Here's a site at Savannah River, much lower angled terrain. This is sandy soil in the coastal plain, of the U.S. over a clay argillic horizon, very low slope angle. Here you need almost a tropical cyclone of 150 millimeters of rainfall to initiate lateral subsurface flow at that soil bedrock interface. Now, moving to Saskatchewan and looking at overland flow increasingly over the last year or so, the more I look at overland flow processes, the more I think it's two sides of the same coin. So here's a photo from Michael Chu at North Dakota State University, and we're just looking at overland flow. This is infiltration excess overland flow on an ag field, and you're again seeing these fill and spill areas as these zones kind of connect with each other and cascade down slope in a threshold-like way. If we look at some data from one of our plots in Saskatchewan, this is a 5-hectare runoff plot, again, infiltration excess overland flow. We see the same kind of threshold behavior in terms of the relationship between total flow at the hill slope scale and storm precipitation. And I think that what we see in infiltration excess is what we see in terms of subsurface infiltration excess. We have a delivery to the surface exceeding the surface infiltrability, but at the same time, continued infiltration or loss with depth. If we look at the subsurface, here's an irrigation experiment we've made of a hill slope. Again, this is in South Carolina from last year. If we irrigate, we're not seeing overland flow, of course, but what we're seeing is effectively infiltration excess overland flow at this lower interface. So in fact, we see this is our zone of that's inducing lateral flow, again with continued loss to the material below. Now, if we work with, say, Hydrus 3D as a kind of a learning tool to explore the effect of that subsoil permeability on the initiation of perching at the soil bedrock interface, we can see that that permeability contrast is really quite important. Here's a 10 times, here's 100 times contrast in terms of soil-subsoil permeability, in terms of these patches of saturation that develop at the subsurface interface. And these connected zones of saturation are really the precondition for lateral flow. As you saw before, without that connectivity, we don't see lateral flow induced. Again, looking in plan view at this kind of abstraction of the Panola hill slope. And we can look at this at different slope angles. Of course, we have the fidelity in a model like Hydrus 3D to explore different slope angles and different rain events. But the point I wanted to make is that just like in infiltration excess overland flow, really it's the permeability contrast that's really a key factor for inducing lateral flow. Now, in terms of simplifying some of this, I think what we're finding at these different hill slopes that we've been trenching and examining, much like overland flow, there's organization. And this organization, in fact, is the upslope accumulated area map for that subsurface interface on the Panola hill slope that I showed you earlier. But what we're finding as well is that it's not just what's upslope that matters, it's also what's downslope. So we've produced a downslope efficiency index. Basically, it's a drainage impedance index, very simple, that says that how far horizontally out in space does one need to go before dropping a prescribed distance. And you can see how different the drainage efficiency index would be if you're at something of a topographic cliff versus if you're at an interface between a steep area and a flat area. And the two together, I think, are a very useful way to classify this kind of filling and spilling, which I think are key elements of more of a hill slope scale flow theory that we might ultimately build towards, where the fill areas are these areas of high flow accumulation and low drainage efficiency, these black areas, which are now the classified image based on the upslope index and the downslope index, and the spill areas are the high flow accumulation and high drainage efficiency. So let's just look at that. If we think of this kind of filling and spilling and linked to slope angle, what we find is that in very low angled terrain, we may be dominated by fill with not a lot of spill, like the South Carolina slope where it took 150 millimeters to induce lateral flow. Here's the Panola slope, kind of intermediate between that. And as we move up in slope, we get into pretty much spill-dominated conditions. Now we can go to hill slopes. This is the Mai slope in New Zealand. Here we've actually removed the soil to try to examine that subsurface interface, the partitioning surface. And here you're seeing the feet of a PhD student, Chris Graham, where we're releasing blue dye coming down the slope over an area of about 10 meters or so. And you see this kind of streaming down slope in an area that's very much spill-dominated. So it's steep enough that it's really defined by largely spilling at this scale. But this is what's going on, although we can't see it, at that soil-bedrock interface and generating the lateral flow that we're examining. And my contention is, or my maybe hypothesis put in front of you is, I think this is just like infiltration excess overland flow, and much of it is aided by extreme anisotropy that occurs at the soil-bedrock interface in these systems that develop. So if I was to think about then how to put this together, this is a diagram that Kieran Harmon had assembled with some of our Panola data some years ago. I think regardless of whether we're talking about overland flow or subsurface storm flow where there's a layer of soil on a surface like this, I think it's, as Sally has shown in some recent papers and going back to some of Tom Dunn's work in the early 90s, the microtopographic relief and movement along this kind of irregular surface is really the key for defining this filling and spilling and patches of connectivity that relate to then the threshold for whether or not the hill slope turns on or not. And each hill slope we've looked at has exhibited this kind of extreme threshold-like behavior. And of course, this is what we ultimately see in the stream, but it's really difficult to unscramble the omelet by interrogating only the rainfall runoff signal. And of course, this is how we're trying to understand these dominant processes that result in this kind of signal. And I think, this is suggesting, at least to me, that rather than looking for differences between these different runoff processes, perhaps there's commonality between these seemingly different runoff mechanisms. And I don't have time to get into this, but I just wanted to make a point that I think it's the same for saturation excess. This is hydrogeosphere output by Frey et al. In 2010, showing filling and spilling in the riparian zone in a way very much similar to what I've been showing for overland flow and subsurface flow. So if this saturation is coming from above or from below, without soil, I think it all boils down to the same thing, and that is the extreme importance of this micro, meso, macro topography in terms of conditioning the lateral flow generation at the hill slope scale. All right, so let me try and wrap up. If we look at a hill slope, I think this is the challenge, at least for me. Here's our hill slope profile. When we put in sat flow sensors on the Panola hill slope, for instance, and we do this during a summer period, we find that in the red line, this is from deeper soil profiles, the transpiration is pretty constant before, after a summer rain event. If we look at transpiration in thin soils, for instance on a site like this or this, when we get a rain event, there's a reawakening of these trees in terms of transpiration. So it seems that there's a very strong link to soil depth and the transpiration response. And this expresses itself now in terms of how the vegetation basal area, which is the map on the left for that same hill slope, really matches the map of soil depth on the right. And the big challenge is, how do we now bring in this kind of transient lateral flow in the context of this relation with that's focusing on storage? And how does this feed back to the generation of lateral flow? And these kinds of feedbacks, I think, are extremely difficult when we imagine that the trees are using water that's not included in this mobile flow. And the mobile flow here, isotopically, is quite different to this distribution of vegetation water on the hill slope. So this is, to me, a really open area in terms of mechanistic understanding of these processes, at least in the environments where I've been looking. The second point, I think, is that to go after these storage questions, really the holy grail for me is understanding and unpacking the transit time distribution of water in the subsurface. So we've looked at this kind of input-output relation, but when we want to understand the transit time or the transit time distribution, we convolve this input isotope signal with a transit time distribution function. We just pick one from a family of curves. Could be an exponential, could be two parallel linear reservoirs, could be any one of these curves to give us the best fit in terms of this outflow. And what we're trying to do in 1D at a site in Oregon at the Terracosm site run by EPA, we have a couple of papers that are starting to explore this. And then at the Biosphere 2 and then at the Hydro Hill site in China, really trying to understand the transit time distribution experimentally and trying to do whole watershed or whole column tracer tests to better understand what this distribution might be. Because at the end of the day, I think this holds the key for integrating what we're seeing in terms of vegetation water use, what's happening in a mobile way at the hill slope or catchment scale. It's all going to be expressed, I think, in this distribution function for water that we might sample at the catchment scale. And then lastly, I think, again, with the spirit of using models as learning tools, we've been building on some work that we did with Peter Lehman in Danny Orr's group, using percolation theory. In this case, we're using directional percolation theory. Again, as a tool to understand what might be common between overland flow and lateral flow at the interface, where we focus more on these patterns of filling and spilling. We link the patterns with the threshold in terms of this flow-rainfall relation I showed you earlier as a way to begin to understand some of the links between these seemingly disparate runoff mechanisms. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. We have time for a few questions.
Jeff, really fine talk. One of the things that your work suggests to me is that one of the fundamental problems facing hydrology is fundamentally a geomorphic problem, which is what is it that defines the topography of the soil bedrock surface? Yeah. And this is turning out to be a very interesting problem that a number of groups are tackling in with a variety of methods. Some of Bill Dietrich's work in California and other related stuff. The interesting point is that in steep land terrain, and maybe in other terrain as well, what sets that topography are actually the trees themselves. Mm-hmm. The rooting, the nature of the rooting, and the weathering that occurs around the rooting. That actually, the trees are in a sense ecological engineers of their own environments, which they then root and get nutrients from. I'm thinking, however, about dryland environments where the water tables are, where the depth to bedrock can often be very, very deep. It suggests to me that that we have to almost conceptualize these things in a different fashion in terms of how we think about this kind of model. But it's very interesting, I think, future for melding these ideas.
Yeah. Well, thanks. One observation going back to the discussion this morning about patterns. We've looked at patterns of soil moisture at the hill slope scale, inspired by some of the work that Western and Grayson have done at Tarawara with soil moisture patterns. And what we find is that those soil moisture patterns don't explain the mapped patterns of transient saturation and lateral flow. And I think the hunt for patterns is very important, but I guess understanding maybe the process link from those patterns is an important quest. And that's something that I think many groups are working on. Yeah. But I think in deeper soils, it's the saturation excess. So I think in deeper soils, often you've got rising water tables coming up to a zone where the transmissivity is greater, so you're getting extreme lateral flow. An example might be the work in till-mantle terrain in Sweden, this transmissivity feedback model. But I think that's what we see in the Oregon Coast Range. That's what we see in these more permeable bedrock environments where we have very deep soil. And I think still that there's irregularities at that partitioning surface, maybe where the transmissivity is high, and that's where we get the significant lateral flux.
Jeff, thanks. Very good talk. I enjoyed it. Question with respect to the stable isotope data. In arid regions, in semi-arid and arid region soils, we often see this strong evaporative enrichment in the root zone. And then we also see, as the aridity increases, we see the recharge water, or the stream, which will eventually generate the stream water, becoming slightly evaporated.
Yeah.
So you'll see it shift off the meteoric water line.
Yeah.
And that's a function of aridity. And I think where that comes from is one of the challenges with stable isotopes is they're not conservative. They go away as the trees take the water up in evaporation. So you're left with maybe a very enriched signal, enriched water, but there's not much of it left. And so when the next rain event comes, that enriched signal is essentially diluted out. And I'm wondering if you've done the kind of the mixing calculations at your site to look at the volumes of water left behind versus the recharge volumes.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. We've done kind of the back of the envelope calculations at the Andrews, and it could be a small number in terms of not being able to see it in the stream.
Yeah.
We've seen it in the stream at the Savannah River site in terms of evaporated water conditions. And just like you're saying, our groundwater falls off the meteoric water line, and each of our kind of reservoirs, if you like, have different kind of characteristic, maybe local meteoric water lines. So that is, I think, a fruitful area to go forward. I think the surprise here, though, was that we thought we were in a very humid environment, but I think that seasonal aridity really played a role in a way that we didn't anticipate, and that's been seen in those other two sites. But your point's well taken.